This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/RubyRogues. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Dave Kimura.
Hey everybody.
Brian Hogan.
Hello.
Eric Berry.
Hey, Happy New Year! Woo!
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Daniel Azuma.
Hello, everyone.
Do you want to give us a brief introduction?
Sure. Daniel, I guess I've been developing for maybe about 20 years or so. I live in Seattle, currently work at Google. Been a Rubyist since maybe 2005 or 2006 or so. Did a bunch of startups, did a bunch of things, and then kind of got sucked into Google, or I should say maybe decided I wanted a little bit of a change and went to Google.
Nice. So what do you do at Google?
Currently, I'm part of the cloud team. I work on a team of language support specialists, programming language support, I should say. I lead the Ruby team there, as well as the Elixir team, and we build things to just help Ruby developers and Elixir developers and so forth get onto Google Cloud Platform and be able to use the tools effectively. So we do kind of a variety of things, developer tools, as well as we kind of serve as language experts, I guess, consultants, maybe internal consultants for some of the product teams. So we help integrate their products with the language when it requires certain programming language expertise.
That's interesting. I'm going to push us on a tangent here for a minute. I don't hear very many Rubyists doing Google Cloud Platform. Are there a lot of people on there?
There are a few. The team itself, well, so Google Cloud Platform is it's a large organization, and it includes a lot of different products, both kind of at the product level. You have App Engine, you have machine learning APIs and things like that, and then you have infrastructure types of things, Protobuf, for example. So some of those teams, like the Protobuf team, have had Ruby developers working on the Ruby version of those for a number of years. So just because we've wanted to make sure that we have good language support, across all the languages that matter. But a lot of maybe the product level teams, Ruby support is something that's a little bit newer. The team that I'm on got started maybe about 2 years ago, and we're about maybe half a dozen Ruby engineers. Some of them, myself included, are kind of more your traditional Google software engineers. Then we have some developer relations type engineers. But yeah, there are a few of us.
Nice. Now, we brought you on to talk about debuggers, and you gave a RubyConf talk about it. Do you want to just give us kind of the 5-minute version, and then we can dig into this and talk about debugging Ruby?
Sure. So the talk kind of came out of some of my work with the product team for the Google Cloud Debugger. This is a debugger that we've actually been using internally at Google for a number of years. It's designed for running on actual live web applications. So you can actually have an application that's serving real traffic, but be able to set breakpoints on it and collect snapshots, and then be able to save those off and analyze them later. So we've been using this internally for as I said, a number of years, and we recently made it available to cloud customers. I worked on the Ruby version of this debugger, basically the Ruby agents that lets you hook into a Ruby web process. And so this was kind of my first debugger project that I worked on. But before this, I actually not really used debuggers very much. They were strange to me. They're kind of intimidating, maybe.
I've heard that story before.
Yeah, I've heard it myself. I actually one of my friends here in Seattle, Aaron Patterson, you guys probably know, recently wrote a blog post about how he's a put-s debuggerer. He doesn't like to use real debugging tools just because they're unfamiliar, and that was me as well. I was just kind of unfamiliar with how they worked and what they were doing behind my back, and I just didn't trust them very much. And so coming on and actually working on the implementation of one of those was a really eye-opening experience for me. And so that's kind of where this talk came from. I spent the first half of the talk just kind of live coding a debugger, just writing, here's how to write a debugger. And so it did breakpoints, it did stepping, it did kind of program state manipulation, all the things that you would expect in a debugger. Really pretty straightforward, not that difficult. And then I spent the second half of the talk talking about the cloud debugger that I work on at Google, and some of the techniques that we used for implementing that, some of the challenges that we faced.
Very cool. So why don't we start with, why use a debugger in the first place? I'll tell you, I generally reach for the put-s initially, and then if it starts to get hard, then sometimes I'll fire up an IDE that has a debugger in it and then use that. So, but why? Why do we need to know these debugger tools? Put-s works most of the time for me.
Yeah, and to be honest, put-s works most of the time for me as well. And to be honest, even though I've kind of had a little bit of an epiphany about debuggers, I still reach for put-s as my first the first tool that I use. But that said, there are, as you said, there are times when it just gets really clumsy. You have to go in and restart your application. You have to figure out where you're gonna put things, what information you want to display. There might be, I guess, especially if the process for getting things started up. So if you have to deploy your application, for example, in order to get it into a state where you can actually run it and either get your put-s or your logging output or whatever, that might take a lot of time. And so the round trip time gets to be a real hassle. What I often end up doing is I'll start with putting a bunch of log statements or a bunch of put-s statements just to kind of get a feel for where things are happening and what and kind of narrow down what's where my issue might be. And then when I want to start doing real detailed work, where I'm going to want to kind of rapidly change what I'm displaying, or I know kind of what I'm looking, maybe the method that I'm looking at, but I want to see what happens when I do this, or see what happens when I do that. And it's kind of that rapid round tripping is where I start reaching for the debugger, because then that's what it's for. You can set up breakpoints, often interactively. change what you're looking at, maybe even change the state of the program on the fly and see what happens. And to be able to do that kind of interactively without that large round trip, I think is where it's a real benefit.
I don't typically use puts as much as I use pry, and I've gone into the debugger process several times where I actually use the debugger, but every single time I do, it seems like it's overcomplicated, and so I always fall to the pry debugger with all of the extra pry add-ons that you can add. I'm fascinated by what you've done with the Google Cloud Platform, in that you can actually debug live applications. Can you explain how that actually works? Because to me, it seems like you'd have to tell the app only debug on this certain instance. How can you actually let the application know that this is the one that you want to debug, but none of the others?
Yeah, so there are different kinds of debuggers. The typical ones that we often work with in Ruby, like pry, they're interactive, right? You hit a breakpoint, and then you can drop into some kind of a shell, like your pry shell, your IRB shell, and then you can interactively interact with the program states. Look at the state of variables, call methods, change things, and see what happens. You can't do that when you have a live web application, right? You can't stop the program because you might have a customer on the other end waiting for a response, and you
or
definitely
trying to pay you money.
Yeah, even more importantly, and especially you don't want to change things. You don't want to change the behavior and potentially break things for a customer, and so. So you have this second type of debugger. That's what the Google Cloud Debugger is. It's instead of interacting with the program, you take a snapshot when you hit a breakpoint. So you specify, I want to break at a certain line, and I want a snapshot of the program state. So I want the values of the local variables. I want maybe the value of some of these instance variables in my current object, maybe evaluate some expressions, basically gather a bunch of information, and then you can just kind of let the program continue to run. The user gets their response back. They can pay you. Everything is cool on that end. And in the meantime, you have this snapshot that then you can analyze offline. And so a lot of then the challenge of that kind of debugger is how do you collect that information quickly so that you don't delay the response to the web application, and how do you collect it safely so that you don't change the behavior of the application by virtue of evaluating things. So, for example, the Google Cloud Debugger, it lets you define expressions. So I can actually say I have a user object. I can call the name method of the user object to get the name of the current user, for example, and then return the result of that as an expression as part of my snapshot. Well, I have to be careful that calling the name method doesn't actually change the value, the state of that object. Now, a well-written application, you don't expect calling an accessor to change the state of an object, but still, we actually allow these are Ruby expressions; they can do anything, and so we actually have a lot of instrumentation around evaluating those expressions to try to ensure that you don't make changes. And so we actually and I talk a little bit about this in the talk, but we have an analyzer for bytecode where we actually look at the expression that you do that you're going to evaluate. We disassemble it. And we look at what it's doing. If it's going to do some things like change the value of an instance variable, or modify a global, or do some other side effect like send bytes on a network connection, or various things like that, then we disallow it. So a lot of care has been put into this just to make sure that we can collect this information safely and quickly.
Is this available only on the Google Cloud platform, or do you know if there are other mechanisms to do the same thing, like, for example, Heroku or Amazon, or even self-hosted?
I'm actually not sure what other similar products there are. The people that some of the early adopters that we've talked to, based on their reactions, it seems pretty unique at the moment. That said, you don't actually your program doesn't actually have to be running on Google Cloud in order to use it. The debugger itself runs on Google Cloud, but your program could be running on AWS or even locally on your own machine. You just have to be running the Ruby agents that my team wrote. It's a Ruby gem, and that connects to the Google Cloud Debugger service, and so you interact with the debugger there.
How would somebody get started doing that? Because that, to me, that sounds like a huge win.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a gem that you install. It's called Google Cloud Debugger. And there's instructions on the README there. It's part of kind of a suite of diagnostics and monitoring tools that they're under the brand name Stackdriver. It's a company that Google owns. So it's the actual product name is Stackdriver Debugger. But we have a Stackdriver gem as well that kind of brings in the debugger as well as logging, error reporting, latency tracing, and so forth. And it automatically integrates with Rails, so you just have to drop the gem into your gem file, and it'll kind of automatically activate all those services. So that's the easiest way to get started with it, is to use a Stackdriver gem. You can use the Google Cloud Debugger gem by itself. There's a few lines of code that you would have to write to activate it then.
So you work with Chris Smith, right?
Yes, Chris Smith and Blomage, Mike Moore.
Mike Moore, yeah, they're both a local. They're both a local to us out here in Utah. Great guys.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they are. I actually I went through there in Salt Lake City last summer on way back from a vacation, and hung out with them a little bit. But yeah, we worked with them. They're contractors with Google, and they did a lot of the work on the API clients that we have. They've just done a really stellar job of making our API clients look Ruby-like, especially because we don't have a lot of Ruby expertise here within Google, and so sometimes without some of the expertise, we end up you end up writing Ruby libraries that look like Java libraries, right? So
yeah, is it primarily Java over there?
It's Java, C++, Python, some Go,
right?
But but Ruby's not one of our internal languages.
Do you ever feel looked down on, or like they kind of snicker at the watering hole? Like, there's the Ruby guy. So funny. It's a Tinker toy.
Not to my face.
You're asking him to throw his coworkers under the bus on a podcast, so that's a little.
It's. In general, people, people get it. It's it's been a very successful language for the past 10, 15 years, and people realize that. They're just so there's still a lot of respect for the language and for the community and everything that's everything that we've accomplished. There just isn't a whole lot of expertise because we don't hire specifically for Ruby skills, and so there's just kind of this self-perpetuating. We don't have a lot of Ruby expertise in house, and so when we interview, we don't check for that, and so we don't get a lot of Ruby expertise moving forward. But there are some well-known Rubyists. My team, Aja Hammerly, who's been on the show before, is on my team. Some real. There are a few of us that are. There are a few of us that are well connected into the community, and but just a few, and so we're spread a little thin sometimes.
Yeah, I do have to say, though, that, I mean, the fact that, Ruby gets any representation at Google. I've talked to a lot of people at Microsoft, and, it's gratifying to see some of that there, too, with their Azure platform and some of the hosting options you have there. But the other thing is just, I like having the option, right? It's, okay, I can put this on Google Cloud Platform. I can put this on Heroku. I can put it on my own server. And just having all these options out there with terrific tooling, and the fact that you're out there making the ecosystem better, it's just kind of a hearty yes, it's your job, but thank you, from the Ruby community, both for these tools as well as just, hey, look, give Google Cloud Platform a try, just like you give some of these other ones a try.
I had a question about the snapshots that you say you take. So, basically a client has a request, it comes through, and you kind of hijack the request, take a snapshot, then fulfill the request really quickly. What's the actual size of the snapshot that gets taken and then pushed over to the debugger for later analysis or whatever? I know it's going to probably vary depending on the request or the size of the application or whatever, but just on average, what have you found for like a standard CRUD Rails application?
Yeah, so it can vary. We by default we capture the local variables and the stack frame. And we actually capture the local variables for, I think it's the first five. I think it's the first 5 frames in the stack trace. But beyond that, I guess in the limits, you could try to capture the entire contents of memory, and that that just that wouldn't work.
That sounds
well.
like a great idea.
So by default, we kind of limit it to the local variables, and then we say, well, if you want other things, you just write an expression. So you want the value of some instance variable, you can create an expression with at my username or whatever your local variable name is. That says, if any one of those objects might be large, we just use inspect for most object types. To serialize it, and so we actually also limit the size and the depth of the serialization, and I can't remember exactly what the default limits are, but once it gets past a certain number of bytes, we say, okay, ... There's more information here if you want more than. Then what you can do actually is we give precedence to the expressions, the user-defined expressions. So if you want a particular piece of information, then put it in an expression. If you want something that's deep down in the object hierarchy, then call those accessors yourself and kind of drill down yourself. There's You bring up something though. It would be nice to be able to customize some of that information, or customize some of those limits. I guess, and I don't think we currently have the ability to say, well, limit it to 10K versus 5K or something like that. That's I don't think we have that. I would have to check. But yeah, we have a particular size limit on the serialization.
Okay. So they're pretty small, 10 kilobytes or whatever. And does the debugger have something where it'll automatically take a snapshot if a error is found? Like if the server is going to end up returning an error 500 to the client, can it capture the variables around or that session around what happened and then automatically send that over to the debugger? Or is it something that's always initiated by a developer?
That is a very interesting feature request that we can we can talk about. No, we don't capture debug information automatically for if an error happens. That said, there is a separate error reporting service as part of Stackdriver where we do capture the exception itself and send it there. And so potentially, I guess the challenge with the debugger is, when there's an error, you don't necessarily know where it comes from, and so it's difficult to say, well, I want these local variables or these expressions to be evaluated, because you don't know what context that's coming from. But yeah, there's potentially there might be some interesting things that you could capture when you detect an error. I have to think about it.
Yeah. Because I'm just thinking with something like Sentry or Rollbar, some error reporting services, they do typically a pretty good job of capturing like the stack trace of where the error was. You can inject in some expressions to capture variables as they occur. But it doesn't have the interaction like you're saying the Google Cloud Platform Debugger has. It's just more of a information dump. Here you go. You can go look at it later. But I'm thinking just, if I'm on the road or if I'm at a coffee shop and I have my tablet, don't have my laptop, so I'm not really ready to dive into something. But if I'm able to inspect some of the variables, play around with it a little bit just from my laptop, then I might be able to go to my code repo, make a quick code change, let it pass the CI/CD, and then do a deployment, right from my phone or tablet. I would think that would be really cool feature requests. So there's some future work for you.
Yeah.
If you get bored, call Dave.
Oh.
We're always we're always really interested to hear what people's ideas and what would really help developers do their job more effectively. That's the point of these tools, whether it's Rollbar or Honeybadger, or whether it's Google Cloud, Stackdriver, or whatever. That's what our goal is.
So I've got a question for you about your journey, getting into the whole debugging process, because you mentioned that you didn't start out really that into debuggers, and you sort of found yourself working with them, and working on one. What was that journey like? What was the sort of what sort of kicked that off, where you sort of decided this is something I need to know about? What was the event or situation that made you think I need to get into this more and learn more about this?
In general, there really wasn't a particular event that sparked an interest. It was more the needs of the debugger team basically came to us as the Ruby team and said, "Hey, we need this." And then there was some panic within the Ruby team. Is okay, who has experience writing debuggers? Well, none of us really did.
And so when you're thrust in a situation like that, where did you start then? Or what was just from a very for thinking about it in terms of a person who might find themselves in that situation, what did you start doing? Did you start looking at debuggers that existed already? Did you start picking apart debuggers that existed for other languages that you could sort of say, well, this is how I would adapt it? I mean, that's sort of what I'm interested in.
Okay. So the first thing that we did was we looked at some of the other languages that the Google Cloud Debugger already supports. so internally, again, we've used this tool for some time already, and for our internal languages, Java, C++, and Python, there are already debugger agents for those languages, and so we talked to the team and say, how are debuggers? How is the debugger implemented for these languages? And so we got some background in just kind of in general what sort of things to look for. Turns out that the basic techniques for implementing debugger, specifically how to detect a breakpoint, is a little bit different in Ruby than it is in some of those other languages, and so we then had to do a little bit of research ourselves into kind of the Ruby community and Ruby debuggers. We looked at Bybug a little bit, so it's probably familiar with that. It's brought into Rails by default, but it's kind of a well thought out kind of traditional shell-based debugger tool for Ruby, and some techniques that it uses. So it uses the trace point API, for example, to detect breakpoints, and so we determined that that was probably going to work for us as well, and so we kind of adopted some techniques from there. But yeah, just kind of doing your research from what's been done in the Ruby community, as well as some of the other languages that the debugger, our debugger library supports.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says "Pay me now." And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Sure. If you had to do it again, what would, if you could talk to your past self, then what would be the one piece of advice that you'd give your past self now that you've gone through this experience?
That's a really good question. I think I would tell myself to spend more time using other debuggers first before digging down and trying to understand how they worked. Because again, at that time I was entirely kind of a put-s debugger. I kind of knew the basics for how to interact with the debugger, but I didn't have a lot of experience with just generally how people use them and what maybe what features mattered and which ones didn't as much. Where performance might matter more than other places, and issues like that. It would have helped us prioritize a little bit better which elements we focused on first. As it turns out, I really only started using debugger once we started testing the debugger that we had written, which
Sure.
I'm kind of curious. I mean, what kinds of things do you wind up learning implementing a debugger? Is it more like VM design, like Ruby VM design, and features that make that easy or may already be built in that are debugger centric? Or is it more around how people actually do development and the processes that they go through in order to make sure that their program works, and then to figure out where it's not working? Or are there completely other things that I'm not even thinking of, as far as processes or stuff like that? What are the lessons that you're going to pick up if you go and decide to write a Ruby debugger?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you touched on the big. I think the big two are, number one, what are those development processes that are useful for troubleshooting, and what kind of techniques open up once you have a tool like this. So, my own troubleshooting technique has expanded somewhat because I have this experience. But also, there's a lot of kind of details about how the Ruby VM works internally that I learned as a result of this. So, things like we had the opportunity to kind of dig into into YARV, into Ruby bytecodes and what the Ruby bytecodes are. What they do, what kind of optimizations are kind of built into the Ruby bytecodes. So there are some things that show up as entire methods on the Ruby end that are just implemented by one bytecode, just because they're so commonly used, and the Ruby core team decided that it would be really useful to just optimize it. Mm-hmm. And so, kind of looking into is kind of how that process works, and what you can do, different ways to I guess interact with the VM, call the VM, see what it's doing, and analyze how a program behaves through those VM calls. That said, we also learned that there are a lot of there's still a lot of kind of limitations into what you can do, especially from Ruby. So if you drop down into C, there are a lot of VM calls that are available, and a lot of analysis that you can do, but very few of those capabilities are exposed up at the Ruby level, and so you actually have to drop down to C to do a number of different things. I think it might be, it looks like the Ruby core team has been very cautious about exposing some of these capabilities. So once you expose them to Ruby, then you're kind of stuck with them. You want to maintain backwards compatibility, mm-hmm. And so they've been really cautious about exposing too much of these internals. But when you're writing a debugger, you often need them. So you really learn, kind of a lot of what's available in C versus what's available in Ruby, and there's a lot that you can do if you drop down to C.
That's really interesting. One other thing that I've seen over the last little while with a lot of the debugging options and libraries that are out there is that they tend to get integrated into things like IDEs and stuff. Do you foresee that as an option for your debugger, or is your debugger more of a standalone service that people are going to connect to?
Currently, it's just a standalone service. We expect that people will just connect to it via the Google Cloud Console. Mm-hmm. That said, there is an API for it. It is definitely possible to integrate it with an IDE. It's actually something that we have talked about in our team before. It hasn't. I guess it hasn't bubbled to the top of the priority list at this point, because we're not really convinced that enough Ruby users use IDEs that or want to do debugging in an IDE, that it, especially for something like debugging a web application that's online, that's live in production. Does it make sense to debug that from an IDE? Well, I'm not sure. So it's something that we've talked about, but maybe you can convince me that it is worthwhile. I mean,
No, pretty sure it's not.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? I mean, just like your debugger, right? Just like the debugger project in the first place, eventually the need for one to exist on the Google platform, was brought to your attention, probably due to some kind of customer research, customer demand. So if you get enough people that are asking for it, it probably becomes a thing. But I think that the fact that you're not getting a lot of people asking for it is probably indicative of the fact that it's not that necessary. So. I don't remember the last time I used an IDE other than Vim. It's been like 10 years, so I'm happy to go to a console somewhere else and look at stuff. But still, the API seems interesting.
Well, the last time I played with an IDE was Visual Studio Code, and we've done shows on it, and I wanted to play with it, and it does interesting things. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, I still lean toward the put S unless I just really, really need more information than, one or two put S's will give me.
Yeah, that's what we found. There are people that use IDEs in the Ruby community, but there just don't seem to be as many as in other languages. So some of our other language teams at Google, they actually spend a lot of time doing IDE integration. We have a C# team that does Visual Studio integration, and the Java team does a lot of IntelliJ work. But for the Ruby team, I mean, my sense is that a lot of us just use Sublime Text or Vim or whatever it is.
Well, it's interesting to me because I've taught a lot of beginners, and I've taught a lot of people who have programmed for years in Ruby, and it is really interesting that if you've got some people who come from other languages, people who come from C# and come from the Java world, they find it absolutely odd that the Ruby community in general tends to move. The IDEs that are available, there's not that many of them, or you're sort of hacking a bunch of things together. They find that very odd, whereas the people who come from other languages don't seem to think that's odd at all, and they just sort of, it's fine, there's not a problem here. And I always kind of wondered, is the lack of IDE support, is it because no one wants it, or is it just because the IDEs don't have the capabilities? I always sort of wondered, is it sort of a chicken and egg type of problem?
Yeah, it might be. I've always just chalked it up as that's just the way the community works. We have our own culture, and that's the way that we like to do things.
Yeah.
So Brian, to give you an answer to that question, my older brother, he is a PhD electrical engineer, works at this big company with all of his fancy other engineers, like real engineers, not software engineers, like the real engineers. And him and his colleagues always referred to Ruby as the Fisher-Price programming language. So, you don't read an instruction manual or need one for a Fisher-Price toy, so why do you need a IDE for Ruby? So
that's pretty good. Okay.
I can't say I agree with that, but there is one opinion.
It is interesting because if you look at one of the things that I've become acutely aware of in the last year was just due to some of the work I'm doing at the day job, I've been interacting with people who do a lot of data science work with Python. And so many of them, the only thing they use is Jupyter Notebook. And if you haven't seen that, that's an IDE kind of in the web browser that you just prop up, and you just paste the code in your browser, hit the run button, and it goes. And it's sort of IDE like. And I find that interesting because if you're doing data science, your primary goal really isn't writing code; it's doing some code to make some problem go away. And so I find that interesting that's there's a tool already for that allows them to do that kind of work. And I always kind of wondered, where's Ruby's tools like that?
Yeah, I guess that's true. I've heard that same thing from a lot of folks. I don't know. Maybe somebody will make a Rupiter.
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear that the Ruby community has done pretty well without tools like that, and it is sort of again indicative of how the community works. and that's kind of a neat thing. I don't need to think about it. It is difficult to explain to people who come from, if you come from a world where you are using an IDE every day with a debugger. I've seen firsthand how hard of a sell that is to convince people. No, you do it with you write Ruby application, full-blown enterprise Ruby applications with a text editor and a console debugger, and they're just like, what? How does that even work? But eventually they managed to figure it out. So
Yeah.
It's duct tape, MacGyver. It's duct tape.
I guess RubyMine would be the jump from going from like Xcode to RubyMine if you're switching languages, and then to Vim or Sublime or VS Code or whatever. I think that's why RubyMine exists, is that's intermediate step.
That's what exactly it is. Well, that's the thing is that it is really comfortable if you come from I'm going to say NetBeans. If you come from NetBeans, it is like, it's very familiar and very, very comfortable. And a lot of people that I've worked with, they don't go any farther than RubyMine, which is cool. And I've always thought RubyMine was just awesome. So, I could just never. And it just scared me too much. It made me think of Java too much. So I just had to get away from it.
Well, that's the thing, is I've talked to a bunch of people who use IntelliJ or what's the plugin for Visual Studio that JetBrains puts together. I'll think of it after the show. I'll be like, oh yeah. Anyway, but they all use the same keyboard shortcuts and stuff. And so I've had people move over and say, oh yeah, it was seamless because, IntelliJ is JetBrains and so is RubyMine. And so, all of their muscle memory kind of came over with them. Just like people tend to install Emacs or Vim keyboard plugins for all of their other programs.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else that we want to dive into with this before we start looking at picks? One thing that I'm wondering, just in general, since you do Google Cloud, is if somebody wanted to put a Ruby app on like App Engine, what do they do? How does that all work?
There's you just specify it's a Ruby app in your App Engine configuration, and it just works. We have we have a runtime for App Engine that actually my team worked on, and it's just a language just like any other language on App Engine.
So you made it easy. I like that.
That's our job.
I've also, like I said, I wind up going to a lot of Microsoft events. One of the things that they've been dealing with a lot lately is Docker. So how does Google App Engine deal with Docker? Is that just as seamless?
Yeah, well, Google App Engine, so we should probably clarify, there are currently two flavors of Google App Engine. There's kind of the classic App Engine, or we call the standard App Engine, and then there's the flexible environment App Engine. The standard App Engine is kind of it dates back to 2008 or something like that. It's been around for a long time. It uses a sandboxing mechanism that I'm not too familiar with. The flexible environment is newer, and it's based on Docker, and so this is the environment that Ruby, the Ruby runtime runs in. So the idea is that you just specify Docker containers, and then App Engine takes those containers and runs them. And so we have a standard mechanism to take a Ruby application and wrap it in a Docker image, and App Engine will do that for you without you having to deal with Docker at all. Or you can create your own Docker image and give it to App Engine. App Engine will run that. So the flexible environment is based on Docker, really, or it uses Docker as kind of its unit of execution, I guess you could say. But yeah, Google has really embraced Docker. I'd say we've been using containers internally for quite some time, but when Docker came out and really kind of made containers easy to use for everyone. It was really exciting for us, and we created Kubernetes, which you might be familiar with, as a way to kind of deploy and orchestrate containers, and made that available. And we built the app in flexible environment on Docker. So Docker is really kind of central to how Google Cloud's how we see Google Cloud hosting your application moving forward. So yeah,
that's cool. The more I dig into Docker, the more I like it. So, all right. Anything else that we want to hit before picks? All right, let's do some picks. For you, the listeners of Ruby Rogues, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Brian, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure, I'll start us with the picks. And I'm actually going to pick Docker. And that's because I spent the last year working with it. And what I want to say is that not so much for like deployment. It's great for deploying your apps and all that. But the place I've been finding it really useful is working on applications locally. I've always had trouble getting on my Mac, getting like Postgres to work properly. I don't know what it is about my Macs or something. There's always something that goes wrong. And if I don't touch it for a while, I go back and all of a sudden I'm missing some library or something didn't update right or whatever. And I've just decided, forget it. I'm just going to spin up a Postgres container, and I can say, I want this directory on my Mac's hard drive to be mounted into the Docker container, and I want to forward this port. And so I can just fire it up, and it's as if I have Postgres installed locally. So I'm tending to use Docker for a lot of development stuff. Do I need Redis really quick for this app, for this project I'm working on? Great, let's spin up a container for it rather than installing it on my system. And then when I don't need it anymore, it's very easy to clean all that kind of stuff up. And so that's sort of what I've been recommending to people who don't really know much about Docker, just looking at the options to run some of the servers that you work with, the database servers, things like that you work with, and kind of try things out that way, because it's something that you're comfortable with. Setting up a MySQL in a container and then connecting to it with a local client is kind of, it's kind of interesting. Let's go to kind of explore that platform. The second pick I've got is a Mac app called MonoDraw, which is something I've been using for a while. It is just an ASCII art diagram application. Sometimes I find that when I want to throw some diagrams in a README file or something, or I just want to sketch something out myself and I want to keep it in text. And I really want to keep it with the documentation. So I've been using this for a while, and it's a fantastic drawing tool. It's just nice to have the text, and it keeps the objects. It actually keeps the ASCII objects as drawing objects, so you don't have to edit them by hand later on. There's things online like ASCII Flow that you can use, but one of its big drawbacks is that it's once you draw it, it's text, and you have to kind of delete the characters. You can't really move the objects around as easily, and MonoDraw handles that, and it's a pretty fantastic app. The other one I have, third pick I have, is a cross-platform app. I think I've done a pick on this before, but it's become an indispensable tool in my daily work. It's called Typora, and it's a markdown editor. It's a visual. It's almost like you're typing in Microsoft Word. Rather than a side-by-side pane, you just type, and as you type, it converts the text that you're typing into Markdown. You can flip over to the code view, but you don't have to. It uses a lot of the common keyboard shortcuts you'd use if you're using a word processor. But one of the neatest things for it is that it has built-in support once you enable it for diagrams in the mermaid language, which you can do flow charting and things like that. And it will insert the diagrams rather than just showing you the code. It will actually convert the code on the fly into the diagrams. So when you publish as a PDF or publish as an HTML document, it will actually convert the diagrams into images. So when you do layouts and stuff, you actually have your images. And that's another way that I'm able to keep diagrams with my writing, as opposed to having to crack open an image editor and do the diagramming that way and then bring the images in. So I found Typora to be an amazing tool for handling that. So those are my picks.
Awesome. Eric, what are your picks?
I just got one. This time. Over the holiday vacation, we had a lot of downtime, and so my wife and I kind of binge watched a new show, at least new to me, on Netflix, which I totally didn't think that she would be into. But it's The Punisher, and it was so good. Not a typical Marvel show. There's no superpowers or anything except the fact that the guy just can't die. But it's a fantastic. I mean, the acting is wonderful. The characters are wonderful. It's just, you really get into it. And so if you're wanting a show to watch with your spouse or just a show to catch up on Netflix, the Punisher is a great show. Awesome.
Dave, what are your picks?
All right, so just two picks. All right, so the first one, since Brian picked Docker, I'll pick again Kitematic, which is a great interface for managing your Docker containers and settings. And if you're not familiar with Docker or don't want to mess with the Docker CLI, this is a great alternative to that. So it's something that I found to be extremely useful and a lot of fun to use. The other one is, I have 3 children, all under they're 4 years old, 3 years old, and 1 year old. So my house is nuts all the time, except they're asleep right now. So that's why you don't hear them screaming. But the one thing that I found that keeps their attention beyond nothing else is this game on my iPhone called Thomas and Friends Mini. It's a really cool game where you can just build your own train track and then put Thomas and other trains on there, and they'll just kind of like race around and bump into each other. But then it also has a augmented reality view where you can actually use your camera on the phone, have it put it on a table or something, the track that you built, and then you can walk around the table and get really close up or far back and, kind of see the augmented reality-ness of it. It's really awesome for kids and me.
Nice. Oh, very cool. So I'm gonna throw in a couple of picks here. One is I just switched business coaches, which is something that I kind of like to do just to get a different aspect on what I'm doing here at devchat.tv. And so my last business coach was really good at kind of the high level big picture focused stuff. And this business coach is really good at here's how you set up a business, here's how you run a team, here's how you hire people, et cetera, et cetera. And he has been tremendous. He has a podcast called Business on Purpose, and it's pretty awesome. I know him from another organization that I used to belong to. And he has a basically 4 steps process that he runs you through in just kind of buckling down and locking down your business so you can be more profitable. And it's been awesome. So I'm going to pick that. And then the other thing that I'm going to throw out is I've been doing the My Ruby story and my Angular story and my JavaScript story. And I had a terrific conversation with Kent C. Dodds yesterday for the My JavaScript story. And it'll come out in a couple of weeks. But overall, I just want to put out there, have conversations with folks. I'm going to lunch with Kent on Friday, and just talking to people and getting to know them and catching up and being friends. It's not always about what we can build or what we think we can do, but sometimes it's just about being people with people. So I'm just going to put that out there as well. Daniel, what are your picks?
Sure. Yeah, I do want to second the Docker pick. That's something that I do all the time. If I just need to install something just to check it out really quick, and I don't want it to, I don't want it to clutter my hard drive or just clutter stuff. I'll just throw it. I'll install the Docker image and play with it in the container. It happens all the time for me. So I do want to second that. The picks I have. So my first pick is it's this project called Music Animation Machine. It's the work of Stephen Malinowski. He's a retired software engineer who's also a musician. He's a accomplished pianist and composer, and he's been putting together a system to visualize musical scores, and you can see it on YouTube if you search for him. I can put a link to that in the chat here, but it's basically animation. So you listen to the piece of music, and then you see an animation of representation of the music score, but it's not like music notation. It's just basically shapes, colors, and animation, different ways to see things like instrumentation, when instruments are playing when, how the different voices relate to each other, where melodies are being copied from one instrument to another. He has ways to visualize harmony and different things, and so it's just a really interesting way to see what. I guess the structure of a piece of music and what's going on. I found that I hear a lot more when I'm able to kind of visualize what's going on in a piece of music. He's done a lot of Bach, I guess, because it's there's Bach is a very structural composer, but he's also done a lot of he's done some jazz, he's done some modern music, he's done all sorts of classical music. Just really, really interesting. I think if you're a musician, it's just really eye-opening to see some of these animations. And even if you're not a musician, they're also just really artistic, and it's really cool to watch. So I'll pick that. I think that's about it.
Awesome. Now, one other thing that I'm curious, if people want to see what you're working on these days, or maybe you have a blog, or you're on Twitter, GitHub, whatever, where do people find you online?
Yeah. So I do have a Twitter, which I don't really tweet. If you want to know why, I did a RailsConf talk in 2013 on philosophy of technology, where I discuss why I don't like Twitter. I have a blog on Daniel-Azuma.com, which I should post more often. I just haven't. I don't know. I guess I'm not online as much as I probably ought to be. But I guess the best place is probably just to go to my website. My contact information is there. And anything significant that I post or whatever, there will be a link from there.
Great. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us about debuggers. It's so fun to just dig into this stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we'll wrap this one up, and we'll catch you all next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.